So I think I'm gonna get us started as soon as possible.
I do.
Hey everyone.
Hello, hello. Let me pin.
Did I turn off some of these lights?
There we go. I've pinned you onto a projector
Oh no.
that all of our members here at Berkeley can see you.
Awesome.
It's like some people are still joining the Zoom, but we should be good. And is there any delay or anything in what you're hearing?
No, it doesn't sound like it.
Okay, just making sure you don't like enter an echo chamber with your own voice.
No, it seems like we're good here.
All right, and I think we're good to go. Well, hello everyone. This is John Escobar. He is MP&E faculty here at Berkeley. Teaches a number of classes. One of the ones we're actually going to be focusing on today is he teaches an advanced miking class for orchestration, which actually collaborates with the advanced orchestration class that is also taught here at Berkeley. Richard Davis is the one that teaches that. And for anyone who is in or knows of the SSP, they do all of those big rehearsal sessions, and then a bunch of MP&E students go and record it and learn about a bunch of techniques for miking. And so one thing that I think like I kind of wish was better about the film scoring program was learning about the recording aspects of everything that we do, because we learn how to compose, we kind of learn how to mix, but we're never really taught how it works when we get to the studio and what exactly happens. So today we're going to go over with John. He works also in the industry, so he knows what he's doing. And I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and tell us what your job is outside of Berkeley, and what it is you do.
Sure. Thanks for having me, you all. And yeah, it's great to be able to talk to you all. As Kensington said, I'm a faculty member in the production and engineering department. And the class that I teach that he's talking about is our MP 436 class, which is an orchestral recording class for film score. And it's essentially geared, it's actually a 3-department collaboration. So in addition to film scoring, we also have the ensemble department collaborating with us. And they actually are the ones that provide the orchestra. So it's not the SSP orchestra, it's a student class orchestra of a 45-piece ensemble. And we basically set it up like a Hollywood scoring session, so just like what would happen in Hollywood or overseas in Prague or whatever, composers show up every week. 6 composers show up and they bring scores that are being sight read by the orchestra. And we are doing all of the technology side of things. The orchestra is learning how to play as an orchestra, and we're coming out with 3 cues every week or 6 cues sometimes. So outside of Berkeley, I do a lot of different things. I do film score work. I also work with an NPR show called From the Top. I'm the associate director of audio production and engineering for From the Top. And From the Top used to be a touring show. And since COVID, we've sort of morphed it into a studio show where the NPR affiliate studios and some other studios around town for our programs that will be broadcast a couple of weeks later. And also the big thing that's happened with COVID is just this idea of remote recording, or sort of the whole build around remote recording. And for any of us especially in the film score world, remote recording isn't new. It's not a COVID development. It's something that we've been doing for at least a decade, if not more, especially with the orchestras in Eastern Europe. when COVID hit, I had about 3 days to build some remote recording kits. I've got some Pelican cases that have microphones and cables and mic stands and a computer and interfaces. And I kind of adapted the whole idea of remote recording in Eastern Europe with an orchestra to something that lives and gets shipped around the country. So we have these Pelicans that go all over the country, and I remote control them. So I sit here in my studio in Boston, and my kits can be anywhere. I just got 2 of them back from South Carolina and New York City, and I never have to leave anywhere. You know, I basically sit here and control it the same way I would control my studio computer. And it's this idea that, you know, even here in my studio, I'm actually, and so I'm always remote controlling something anyway. So that's been a big part of my life for the last 18 or 24 months or whatever it's been now. And in addition to all of that, I'm a freelance producer, and I work with independent artists and labels making records. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, my world in and out of Berkeley. And yeah, and for you all in the film scoring department is the fact that you're technically in a composition major, but it's so much more than a composition major. It's a incredibly tech heavy composition major. You almost have to, in some ways, be better than the studios and engineers that you go into with your scores, with your compositions, because you really have to know what it is they're going to do. And ultimately, you have to know how to ask for what you need in order to get the assets back that will be usable for you to then deliver the things you need to deliver to whoever it is that you're delivering to. So I thought that one good way to get this conversation going So I'm going to do a quick screen share here. Oh, could you give me screen sharing preferences?
I was just about to do that. Let me make sure. Oh, yeah, I can stop. That's what I was doing. So, hello. I think you should be able to now.
Let's try. Cool. So we're going to do this. Hang on. Too many things going on as usual. All right. Is everybody seeing my Pro Tools screen here?
Yes, we are.
Awesome. So what I pulled up here is actually from a film that I did with Claudio Ragazzi from your film scoring department. Claudio and I have worked on a lot of different things together, including scores, and we're currently working on his record together. So we're sort of longtime collaborators. And this kind of helps us talk not just about the recording side of things, but also the mixing side of things, and my particular approach to the mixing of a score, which, you know, whenever you talk to anyone really about either recording or mixing, everybody's going to have sort of their own slight take on how they go about it, but there's some fundamental go into it. So I'm first going to talk you through what you're seeing here on my screen, and then I'll let you guys hear it and we can sort of discuss why I did some of the things I did. Okay, so up at the very top of the screen, what you guys are seeing here is prelays, right? Or sequenced material that we used in addition. So Claudio, this is actually a score that I didn't record. It was recorded in, where was this recorded? This was recorded in Budapest. Yeah. And so, but what was great about this particular project, and what is always a great idea for you guys going into the recording studio, is to hopefully have whoever's going to record, or potentially whoever's going to record and mix later, involved in the project as early as you possibly can get them involved. So I was actually involved with this project from the very, very beginning. This was a film that, or this is a score to a film for the Museum of Science and NASA's 60th anniversary that was shown at the Boston Planetarium. And it was really challenging in many different ways, but first and foremost for me and Claudio, it was really challenging because it was going to be projected in a but because of that, I actually got involved in the project really early on. And so even though I didn't record it, I had certain requests from, or to have Claudio ask the studio that was going to record it in Budapest, so that I got the kinds of things that I needed. And for instance, in addition to the sequence material, we've got layers of orchestra. And the one important thing about
The people who are further along in the program may, but you might want to explain it for everyone who doesn't.
Great. So a decatry is a style of recording specific to orchestras. So let me just pull this up here. So it's a 3-mic configuration that is used oftentimes with large ensembles, large orchestral ensembles, and it's most often placed directly above the conductor. So think of this kind of like a bird's eye view of whatever's happening in the room. And the beautiful thing about this is that just like the conductor is trying to balance the orchestra so that it sounds good to them at their vantage point of the ensemble, this decatry is getting that similar vantage point, maybe with a little bit more height. So it's really like, if the ensemble is playing well, if it's well balanced, if the orchestration sounds good, these 3 mics pretty much give you the sense of the music that's in front of them. Okay, so this is a big bread and butter of an orchestral setup from a recording standpoint, and also later on for the mix, this is really what we use largely. Like, this gives you that big sort of Hollywood string sound, if you will. And in addition to that, you use outriggers, which is basically room mics. So you've got like the decatry right above the conductor, and then on the sides of the decatry, maybe 6 or 10 feet on the side, depending on how big the room is, you'll have 2 more microphones kind of pointing at the orchestra, so that, if, for lack of better words, you kind of have like bird's eye view and wide bird's eye view, if that makes sense to you all. Okay. And so in the case of this particular cue, we knew that we were likely going to end up with a lot of layers, and that's a pretty common thing in orchestral recordings, where you end up with sort of one stack of orchestra where everybody, meaning all of the orchestra, is playing like violin 1 part, right? So you've got a 12 or 24 piece violin section, and instead of splitting them up to 12 and 12, you tell all 24 string players to play violin 1. And then you fold that over and you record the exact same set of people, 24 players, but now playing violin 2. And you can do that with strings, with brass. We tend not to do it too much with percussion because there's a lot of flamming and phase issues that happen there. But with things like strings, woodwinds, and brass, it actually helps us make a sonic texture that sounds bigger than the ensemble is actually in the room, right? And you typically, in order to do layering, you typically want more than, I would say 2 people. You never want to do it with 1 string player. So I know you guys are probably coming into doing some of your first recordings at Berklee with the engineers. If you only have 1 sitting violinist, 1 violist, 1 cello player, don't bother layering. That won't work at all. Because the thing that works about layering is the fact that you're basically using to your advantage. You're creatively using the fact that nobody, no matter how good your players are, can play exactly the same timing, pitch, dynamic reference twice in a row. It's always going to be slightly different. And that slight difference is actually what makes this whole thing work when it's a group of people, because it sounds like more people. It's like the chorus effect, right? It basically is a way of faking more people than you actually have sitting. But if you don't have enough people, if it's just 1 or 2 players, you're hearing too much of that discrepancy. You're hearing the fact that they're not exactly in time, they're not exactly in tune, and they're not exactly leveled the same way as they were before. And then at that point, we start talking about that as just being bad phase. Okay, so we're really talking about the relationship of these recordings into the same microphone. Sometimes what I'll actually do, if I've got a smaller group of people, like if I've got 3 string players, when I go to double, I actually have them switch seats so that they're arriving at the microphone from a different angle and at a different sort of time as before. You guys have to remember that microphones are really just very sensitive ears. And so just like what would happen with you, if you were the microphone standing in front of your string players, if your string players suddenly rotate in the seats, that section is going to sound slightly different to your ear, and to a microphone, that slight difference is over exaggerated. I'm going to pause for a second because there's a question here in the chat, which says, how do you translate a Decatree setup to working with virtual instruments and mock-ups? Can you expand that question? What do you mean exactly by that?
Sorry. Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for doing this. First of all, I really appreciate it. My name is adolescent. Have live players. How do I make that happen? Is that possible?
Got it. I guess the short answer is yes, depending on what samples you're using.
Okay.
In some cases, some libraries are going to give you the ability to manipulate the distance of the sample that you're using. So you can effectively tell it that you want a close-up sample or a medium sample or a far sample. And that will help you sort of mimic the idea of what a Decatree is doing, because think about, again, just imagine yourselves on a podium standing in front of an ensemble. It means that to your ears and to the microphones, the way that the ensemble is positioned, the fact that traditionally we'll have first violins on your left, second violins following that, the violas in the middle, the cello on the right side, maybe the basses between viola and cello. You'll have woodwinds behind the strings and then brass behind the woodwinds. You're getting not just left and right directionality, but you're also getting depth from that. And your ears and the Decatree microphones will kind of, that will be a perceivable difference to us. We have the ability to perceive direction and depth in the way that we hear, and microphones help us mimic that when we use them as stereo configurations, at multi-mic configurations, the way we've got this. So, so if I were doing a virtual instrument sort of mock-up, that's one thing I would do, is I would maybe choose different distances in the samples that I'm using. The other thing, and this again doesn't apply to all sample libraries, but you might have the ability to tell the sample where in panning it's going to be placed. And then you can sort of do your violins here, your violas here, your cello, your woodwinds, etc. And that'll now, in reality, most sample libraries are actually pre-panned, right? Most sample libraries are in stereo and they're already pre-panned, and they're pre-panned because they were already recorded that way. So, you know, the violins are recorded. If you ever print your violin virtual instrument, you'll notice that the left side of the stereo channel is louder than the right side of the stereo channel, just the waveform, right? And that's automatically telling me like, okay, violins are over on the left-hand side, right? So you might be stuck with that. But those are two ways or two things that I would do to sort of think about virtual instruments and mocking this Deca tree idea with virtual instruments. So let's keep going here. I'm seeing this message about waiting to do questions at the end. So I'll just keep pushing forward here. So the Deca tree and the outriggers are going to be, you know, your big picture, and it's going to, when I start layering, when I start doing violin 1 everybody and then violin 2 everybody, it's giving me the ability to not just expand the ensemble, but also reconfigure the way that I'm using those microphones, even just in volume. You know, I can take the entire stack of violin 2s, and as a mixer, I can decide how much or how little violin 2 I want in my mix. So it gives me further control. It gives you further control later down the line to decide how to really balance the score based on whatever is needed that's being dictated by picture. The other thing that's very common is to have sectional or spot microphones, we sometimes call them. So the remaining tracks that you all see here, not all of my stacks have that, but you've got sort of like violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, and in some cases we've got multiple mics there. And what that really tells me, this was actually a fairly large orchestra. So this is close miking that is put, you know, for instance, if you were to come to our Monday morning orchestral recording class, you would see that we've got the Deca tree, and then we've got, we call it like a sectional overhead. So it's a microphone that hangs kind of above the middle of the section that it's in. So for violin 1s, if we've got 8 violins in my first violin section, we take a microphone and we put it roughly at the 4th seat of that section, sort of looking backwards, and we're using it like a regional view of just the first violin section. And then in addition to that, in the front of the section, we've got kind of like a spot microphone, or sometimes I think of it as a solo mic, because usually if you're going to have a cue that has a violin solo, it's always going to be the first chair violin. So it does two things. It gives me the front half of the section and looking back at the entire row of 8, but it also gives me a close perspective on first and second chairs in case those first and second chairs are going to be taking solos of any kind. Okay, so we've got strings, we've got a couple woodwinds. Woodwinds are actually a little bit different because most of the time, even though you've got a woodwind section that sort of sits all together, they're very rarely all playing exactly the same thing. You know, you're, and sorry, I didn't go far enough. Here's my woodwinds. You've got, you know, your flutes and your oboes and clarinets and bassoons are usually playing counterpunctal sort of lines, you know, and they're counterpunctal both to themselves, but also to other sections in the ensemble, like the string section or the brass section. And so we tend to individually mic each one of those instruments because it gives us the most versatility later at the recording stage. Okay, and we do the same thing with the brass section. You'll have individual mics, and the one difference to that is that perhaps things like the horn section, the French horn section, you kind of group them together. And the reason we do that is because oftentimes the French horn section is playing much simpler, much more legato lines. And they're all kind of playing the same texture or the same line. And so we can kind of mic them as a body together, if you will. And in this case, we actually had a front and a back. And the reason we do a front and a back is because in an instrument like a French horn, the bell is actually projecting backwards. So if we want that real present brassy sound, we want to mic something in the back. That's what actually in a corner. And one of the reasons for that is that we're actually using the physical wall, the corner, as part of the projection mechanism for that horn. So the bell is blowing air backwards and it's hitting that wall, that resonant surface behind them. And the resonant surface is actually reflecting their sound forward. So that's part of the sound that makes a French horn. So when we put mics in the front, we're actually capturing kind of the sound of the instrument directly, but we're also mostly capturing the reflection that's coming off of whatever the surface is behind them. Yeah. So I'm going to play this score for you, or this cue for you all. And then I can talk you through sort of the routing that I did here. Let me know. Let me just do a quick sound check here to make sure everybody's hearing this. So I'm going to mute myself and just give me a thumbs up if you hear it. Sorry, I don't hear it, so stand by. Give me 1 second. I was just playing this. So what broke?
I remember Zoom is always hard to get audio.
Let's do it this way. Oh, I know what I did wrong. Hang on. That was my fault. Let me fix that. It's been a packed day already. I've done a session in Singapore and New York. So my brain is kind of all over the place. All right, let's try this one more time. So if we do this. Awesome. See, when I think about it, it works. All right, so here's the cue. This is, so the film is called The Red Planet. It's a film about human exploration of Mars. And this is kind of like the intro, sort of the opening scene of the film where you're just doing like a bird's eye view of the Martian terrain and whatnot. So let's see, do I have video on here? I may not have video. Yeah, here you go. This is video. It's a very funny looking video because it's a planetarium. So it's a spherical projector. Okay, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when we watch it like this. It makes a lot more sense when you're actually watching.
So, sort of crossing the line over to the mix, right? Our job when we're recording a score is to get as much detail of the performance that's in front of the microphones or that's in the room, and at the same time give enough bandwidth or room for manipulation later down the road. And so when I sit down to mix a score, there's a couple of things that are running through my mind. Number one, I'm just like, from a technical standpoint, I'm looking at the recording that I'm being given or that I made, and I'm making sure that dynamically it's following whatever's written in the score. And then the other types of things that run through my mind are, what is the, what's the delivery of this film? Where is it going to be shown? What is the theater? Is it a theatrical release? Is it a stereo? Ultimately, that's going to inform how I approach the mix and how complex I get it, right? So I like to sort of consider my end goal and then work backwards from there. And so what that means for a film like this is that I need to set up a system inside of my mixing platform
where I can deliver, or I can derive all of the various versions of deliverables that I need to have. I think that's one really important time-saving thing, because as we all know, a film score has a couple of hours worth of music sometimes, right? We've got like 50 cues, 60 cues, whatever it is. And for each of those cues, there's going to be not just one mix. There's going to be a stack of information that's needed, right? When we give it to the dub stage, the mastering stage, we're usually giving them a couple of different versions of things, and it's to give them options. And the options are based on what else is happening in the film, right? Is there dialogue? Is it a fight scene? Are there sound effects? And how are all of those other audio assets relating with the music that we're creating? And so in the case of this, we ended up with a 5-1 mix. We ended up with a stereo mix. We did stems of the cues. So we've got basically like orchestra. So it's everybody. It's strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion. We've got a lot of synth in this score. So high synths and low synths, percussion only. And actually, I guess that means I kept percussion out of here. Reverbs, one of the reasons I give reverb stems is because, especially for surround playback, which I call my other stem. And really, my other stem is anything that doesn't neatly fold into the categories that I just described. So like if we had, Claudio did a lot of guitar effects for this score. So all of my weird guitar effects have its own print. I always joke, like if I had a didgeridoo doesn't necessarily easily fit into any of my musical categories. So I might put that in my other stem. It's like anything that might be useful to isolate. And then the last thing I did for this, which we're not seeing here, is I actually broke my 5-1. And the reason I did that specifically for this score is that it was going to be shown in in planetariums. So this film actually went all around the world, I believe, in different planetariums. And a planetarium playback system is really unique because you've got like a semicircle screen, and you have your speakers are behind that screen, but all around the dome. And so you kind of have like a dual 5.1 surround system. So imagine like a 5.1 system facing another 5.1 system. And in the middle of that, they usually run a line of speakers that goes from one end of the dome to the other end of the dome, all the way up in an arc. And that's your center channel, right? So dialogue basically lives in the center channel, and then everything else happens in these speakers that are kind of dispersed all over the place. And so I thought to myself, how am I going to help them control my mix the best? And one of the challenges of doing this kind of thing first is that what I'm trying to decide is what kinds of problems is the dubbing stage potentially going to face, and how can I help fix that problem or help them give a resolution to that problem that will ultimately not end up in them just turning the mix down, my musical mix down, because we spend so much time working on the music and so much time working on the mix. And the last thing I want is for whoever's dubbing the film to say, you know what, this cue is getting in the way of my dialogue, or there's this sound effect of a rocket and my music is, there's too much low synth in here, so I'm just going to turn down the mix. That sucks. Right? We put way too much effort into the music for that to happen. So I'm trying to give them ways to resolve those issues while at the same time not giving them so much control that they can potentially break my mix. Okay, so the idea here is that I was giving them a way of controlling the front of a 5.1 system and the back of a 5.1 system. So anything I sent to the front, left, center, right, and anything I sent to the back, left and right, surrounds, were separated as their own stems. And that way they had a way to manipulate and play with that if needed. And ultimately, if I play all of these stems together, it equals both my stereo mix and my 5.1 mix. Okay. And ultimately, the goal of doing this is so that when I bounce to disc, I'm automatically bouncing out all of these channels simultaneously. I've got like 50 some cues to get through. I don't have time to do 16 bounces per cue. I need to hit bounce to disc and it all goes simultaneously and they're all exactly the same start and end length. So that's always a really important sort of very technical thing that sets the stage for how I'm going to mix. And then how I'm going to mix is I like to do, and this is something that I don't know if every mixer does. I know some people just put everything together. I like to sort of think about those stems that I'm going to deliver and think about the categories of instrumentation that I have in the cue and sort of separate them. So I've got a woodwind submix, I've got a brass submix, I've got a percussion submix, I've got orchestral submix, which would be like all of my orchestra, and then I've got my strings. So basically, strings go here, brass goes here, woodwinds go here, and then woodwinds, brass, and strings feed my orchestral submix. So I'm giving myself layers of control to actually get out of my speakers, and or rather in this case to get to these stems, right? And that serves a couple of things. Number one, it gives me a variety of different places where I can turn volume up and down. So when I decide that I need more strings against woodwinds, I don't have to go over here and go, okay, where's all my strings? This is a string, this is, right? That would take too much time for me to grab all of those tracks together and figure out how to turn them up or turn them down simultaneously. Whereas here I say, okay, give me more strings, and I grab the fader that is strings and I do this, right? Or this rather. Okay, so it's a way for me to manipulate the mix in various stages. The other thing that this helps me is to Ellis's question earlier of making it feel like the orchestra that was recorded plus the sequence that's being used all live inside of the same world spatially, right? So I'm using submixes as the place where I'm feeding has sends on it, or very little stuff has sends on it. And mostly all of my sends are happening in these submixes so that it feels like my string section is going to reverb and my woodwind section is going to reverb cumulatively. It's all of the things that make up my string section and all of the things that make up my woodwind section, all of the things that make up my synth section. And what that helps me do is set those layers of depth in my mix so that it feels like my strings are up front, my woodwinds are in the middle, my brass is behind, my percussion is the last layer. You know, it sort of sets that front to back dimension in the mix. You know, I often sort of try and visualize, and I talk about this in all of my mixing classes, of visualizing a mix like a three-dimensional virtual box that we're trying to fill, right? Where height is actually my dynamics, it's my volume, width is my panning, and depth is all of my time-based stuff. It's reverbs, delays, choruses, anything that helps me create the illusion of space. And so that in a nutshell is kind of my approach to mixing, you know, and then I use a few different reverbs, mostly because I'm trying to emulate what happens naturally. Any space, like all of you that are in this classroom, most of the sound that you hear is the acoustics of the room that you're physically in right now. But I know there's a hallway out there through some double doors, and those aren't the most soundproof doors. And so part of the sound that makes up that room is the sound that's bleeding in through the doors, or above or below, the floor above, the floor below. So acoustically, sound is pretty complex, and rooms are pretty complex in how they create these reflections. And those reflections are kind of informed by all of this other bleed from other areas. So when I'm doing mixes, I'm sort of trying to recreate that idea by using multiple reverbs, and I feed reverbs into reverbs to sort of recreate that mush that happens in the natural physical world. Yeah, this is a conversation that could probably go on for days, but hopefully that gives you kind of a ballpark of the approach and the thought process behind both behind recording and mixing, and some of the things that we're trying to accomplish and how we go about it.
Yes, it very much summed up many aspects really, really well. I appreciate that. We have a little bit of time, so we're going to go straight into questions that we might have from either the people on Zoom or the people here in the audience. Any questions? There's a lot. Yeah.
When you deliver materials back to a composer, do you give printed stems or a full mix session?
It depends on the timeline of things. I actually oftentimes do both. I give them printed stems in stems locked in the timeline, locked to time code, because that also helps me and helps them figure out all of the transitions between cues. I sort of do this checkerboard thing so that we can figure out if the mixes are actually working to go from cue to cue. And oftentimes that's an asset that you can send over to the dub stage, and they can use that as part of the build that they're going to use.
He said, thank you. Sorry, I didn't unmute right there, but that answered his question, I believe. And then it looks like Ellis was asking about submix. Is that considered the same thing?
Grouping together elements. So think of your string section, right? Your string section is high strings, medium strings, low strings, right? But together they make up the string section. So rather than, and because of how we're recording them, where we talked about the fact that we might have Decatree plus individual section mics plus solo mics plus all of these things. So your violin actually has 2, 3, 4 tracks that make up violin, and that applies to the rest of the string section. So a submix is a way for me to take all of the microphones, all of the channels that make up that section, and essentially group them together, but it's not a physical grouping. In other words, I don't necessarily intend for me to move one track and they all move together. And on that submix, I control the global volume of everything. Really, it's no different than, my main volume for my speakers. It's controlling whatever I'm feeding to my speakers. So a submix is like for sectional things.
Wonderful. And then it looks like we have one more question, going once, going twice. One more question from Lauren.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I am having my session recorded by a lot of the people in your orchestral recording class. Peter and Phil are actually leading it up. And I can't remember who, but one of them asked me how I felt about arranging the orchestra so like the basses are down the middle and the instruments kind of like fan out. What were your opinions on mixing, like recording in a like orchestral standard seating?
I think that that's a great conversation to have. And it really depends on your score. It depends on your cue. I think that if the low end is really integral to the music that you wrote, then it actually makes a lot of sense to keep them in the middle, because that's ultimately where it's going to end up. And what happens, especially, I'm assuming that they're asking that because the intention is that they're going to have room mics. They're going to have a Deca-Tree plus these individual mics. And so what would happen if you had your Deca-Tree it's fighting the positional direction of the Deca-Tree, and we're going to call that a phase issue, right? So it'll make it so that your low end, your basses actually don't sound as present as you intend them to, because you're moving them from where the Deca-Tree actually intends them to be. Does that answer your question?
You're saying that by putting it like off to the right in between violas and cellos, that's what causes a phase issue potentially?
If your Deca-Tree is actually a Deca-Tree.
Yeah.
Right. And if like,
Yeah.
let's say that your score has a solo bass line, right? And so what you probably want is you want that solo bass line to be brought up in the final mix. And when you bring it up, if it's over on the right-hand side, it's going to sound a little bit weird, because it's going to draw a lot of attention to the right-hand side of your mix. And I often call that, your mix kind of feels lopsided. And so the instinct is going to be, well, let's just pan the basses to the middle, because then the mix isn't lopsided. But if I do that, then I either need to not use my Deca-Tree and just rely on spot microphones, or I'm going to be fighting this incoherence, right? The fact that there was a set of ears, my Deca-Tree, that saw that the basses were physically on the right-hand side. And then I've got localized ears, my bass mic, which doesn't care about the physical position of the bass. And when those two don't go hand in hand, that's the phase issue that I'm fighting.
I keep on forgetting to unmute, but she says thank you. I believe that is everything. I think I answered Michael's question. So let's give a round of applause. Thank you very much again for coming. I think we all learned quite a lot from that. And it was a lot, but it was a good rundown. And we did record this. Is it okay if it's uploaded onto our FSN YouTube channel?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay, so I'll try and do that as soon as I can, so you guys can watch it again if you need to.
Awesome.
That wraps it up.
I am on campus, so if people have questions, you know where to find me, put it that way. So feel free.
All right, I'll see you. Thank you again. And that wraps it up. Bye everyone on Zoom. See you later.